I want to go to your article you wrote, Digital Phoenicians, which is a personal favorite of mine, and I think it aligns very well with with everyone talking about the network state and whatnot. So, can you give like a little bit of a summary of your Digital Phoenicians paper? Like to me, it's like people think of like people think in like like Roman Empire, they had all this territory, they were so Chad, blah blah blah. But at the end, it was the Phoenicians, and which became the Carthaginians, that had the vast trade networks at first, and they were actually the more Chad Empire, but we don't recognize them as much because they were just like lit to like solve the earth from Rome.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess like a bit of like the historical context is like the Phoenicians came from Lebanon, and then they colonized the whole Mediterranean basin. And eventually they were very good sailors, so they like moved around a lot. They sailed apparently all the way to like Cameroon at one point, which nobody would do that again for like till the 1500s. And this was like
They sailed to Cameroon. I didn't know that.
it's like it's a subject of controversy, but there was an expedition that went out of Morocco, like somewhere in West Africa, but no one sailed there for like hundreds more years, thousands more years, really, until the Portuguese, right? So they made it pretty far. They had lots of colonies, but they operated in a more efficient way than the big empires that were around them, and they were able to like sustain themselves by just selling stuff to these empires all the time, whatever it might be: dye, cedar wood, tin, ivory, what have olive oil, whatever. So the comparison here is that like we live amongst like a bunch of degenerate, massive empires around the world, and they're very inefficient. They don't move quickly. But much like in the case of the Phoenicians as well, like they'll destroy themselves, right? Like we just have to sit here and be more efficient, solve problems when they arise, and provide cost savings and efficiency to the people around us. But if you really believe in crypto, I think that you're part of that belief system inherent in it is the idea that like the stuff around us will fail and like we shouldn't. And ideally that's like kind of a controlled failure. And I think it's more likely than not to happen at some point. Maybe in our lifetimes, maybe not. But obviously when I say fail, I don't mean like nuclear war, right? Because like apocalypse is not going to be good for us.
Yeah.
We all depend on electricity. Crypto does not work without the internet, doesn't work without electrons and wires, right? Like that just can't happen. But I do think, on the other hand, that like books like The Sovereign Individual were pretty like accurate in saying that things like jurisdictional arbitrage will become really common, and that people will start sidestepping their state government a lot in the coming years, right? Like how many people have just like randomly moved to Lisbon? Why?
Because it was many.
Favorable tax policy, right? Like even people who like their country a lot are now thinking more in terms of like, what's best for me? Where can I live that's best for me? Not like, oh, I'm just rooted in this town that I've always lived in. And so like the Phoenicians were very efficient, right? They actually survived the Bronze Age collapse at a time when basically nobody else did. The Bronze Age collapse is like the worst event to ever happen in human history, basically, when like all of the major Near Eastern societies fell apart at the same time.
They literally lost writing. That's the equivalent of us losing the internet.
Yeah, they basically regressed by like 1,000+ years. And it actually also caused a lot of new languages to emerge because there were so many refugees just like wandering around that like came into contact with each other and didn't know how to communicate. It like prompted a lot. It's a whole rabbit hole. It's like really interesting, but a bit off topic. But anyways, many of the Phoenician states survived as a result. And they were able to do so because they were efficient, and they just like they had what they needed, and they did something very well, and they executed on it. And I think that's like a similar position to where we find ourselves today, where it's like we can just let the rest kind of fall apart. We don't need to go like wage a guerrilla war against the government, and we also don't need to like roll over and say, please regulate me.
Regulate me, Daddy.
Please, like, civil me and regulate me. But I think that there's an assumption inherent to a lot of people in the space that like stuff will just continue to deteriorate around us, and if it does so at the right rate, then we're positioned to kind of just take over.
So
and be
what does crypto
2.0.
do really well that it can take over? Is it coordination? Is it sending value? Like, what is it in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it's sending value, coordination, trustlessness. So like the ability to interact in a fully trustless manner. I think trustlessness translates to speed. Like, why do you want to interact trustlessly, right? I mean, one, it's safety. You don't have to trust anybody, which I find is like a weird concept to try to explain to older people.
Even the term trustless is like very weird. Wait, less trust? Like, isn't that a bad thing?
Yeah, well, it's that, but also like you gotta remember, like we all grew up with like the internet as kind of just a fact of life, right? Like that. When you grow up like spending more time on the internet, you develop like bullshit radar really quickly because otherwise you're gonna get scammed or
Real
like
quick.
hurt yourself or see something you don't want to see, right? So you learn how to like avoid stuff. And so by default, I think this applies mostly to people like under the age of 40, because even people who were like 40 years old, you know, born in like 1982, like would have had the early internet. And honestly, the early internet was worse than now, because there was no content moderation. So like, right, like you don't want to stumble onto a link and either get a virus on your computer and ruin it, or like see something awful, or accidentally access some kind of something illegal that might, you know, get you in trouble with the authorities or something. You don't want that. So you develop like kind of a sense of being like, okay, this is bullshit. I'm not clicking that. And so you inherently don't trust things until you have a reason to trust them. But if you grew up in like the 1950s, you know, you knew everyone in your town, you went to like the friendly mom and pop shop and you talked to the people who worked there, you know, nice life. Right. So like, they're like, yeah, I want that. I want to be able to trust people. We're like, no, I don't trust anybody, because I don't know, like that person with like the anime PFP, that could be a Fed. That could be like somebody who wants to hurt me. That could be somebody who's just like bad and just has bad things and I don't want to see it. Right. Like there could be so many different possibilities. And you just inherently don't trust people. So it takes time to build trust regardless. Right. And more people aren't like born into a trustful context anymore, because a lot of people don't live with the same community that like 6 generations of their family did anymore. We live in big cities, right? I think we're all probably in a multi-million person city right now. So it doesn't work like that anymore. And so having trustless interaction means that you can interact more quickly. And that's a big efficiency boost, right? So like we do that well. We do value sending really well. We do like enforceable public rules really well. Automation getting better at, I think. So there's so many different things that like we just have the better solution. Economy of scale as well, like networks, all of that enables you to have economies of scale. Things will be cheaper.
I really like what you said of we don't have to fight. We can just literally wait it out because we do have the better system. Let time take its course. And eventually, you know, as I said at the beginning of the episode, like what will it take for the world to go on chain? Like this is how it happens. This is like a big part of how it happens. It's just being a better system overall.
And the question is, do you want to like permission the better system and then like use it to allow the government or like the sort of status quo to sustain itself over time? Or do we want to just sit there and say like, okay, you guys are going to implode on yourself at some point. We don't need to really do anything about that. But when you do, we will replace you, right? It's like replacement versus bolstering. It's kind of like the argument now, it seems like. And some people want to say, look, we want to permission this. We want to get the institutions in here. We want to like have them plug in. But that's like short-term monetary gain. But like over the long term, I don't think you want to like, use this as sustainability tech for somebody else in their system, right? Like we should hopefully someday kind of strap. But that's very utopian. And, you know, we're all still benefactors of like the current status quo in one way or another.
Especially as Americans.